Welcome everyone. This is Mindy Eggen and I'm excited to be on the MFT YouTube channel. Today I'll be showing you how I created this card using a trapped embossed resist technique. For this, I'll be using the loosely lined flowers background stamp set. For this, I'll need to ink blend a background panel. I'm using Squeezed Lemonade, Dried Marigold, and Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide inks. I'm starting with a piece of white cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm going to start with the lightest color first, which is the Squeezed Lemonade, blending that about 1/3 of the way down the card. Then I'll bring in the Dried Marigold, starting off from the side. Now these don't have to be blended together perfectly. I do go back and help blend those lines together, but that's more out of habit. You don't have to make sure it's a seamless blend. And I'm purposely starting with light colors first. I'm going to add dark colors on top of this. I've done this technique before where I've added a pigment white ink on top, but this time I want to go for a very dramatic effect. So once I have those colors blended on there, I'm going to speed this up by heating it with my heat tool. You want to make sure that this background panel is really nice and dry. Then I'm going to take the loosely lined flowers stamp set, remove the backing of it, and I'm going to place this into my MISTI stamping tool. Now when using a MISTI tool, you will need to remove the foam insert that is in there since our background stamp already has foam attached to it. Now I'm going to take my piece of cardstock, I'm adding a little bit of adhesive to the back of it, and I'm lining it up on that stamp set where I want it to go. Then I'm going to close the door of my MISTI, but backwards. And then that little bit of adhesive is going to stick to the bottom of my MISTI. This way, that cardstock is lined up exactly where I want it to be, and I'll have coverage over the entire background. Then I'm going to just prep that with an anti-static powder tool. Brush that powder across everywhere because I'm going to be heat embossing on this. So I want to make sure my embossing powder is only sticking to where I have the Versamark ink. After I have that stamp inked up completely, I'm going to close that door and give this a really good push and make sure I have even coverage. Then I'm sprinkling on clear embossing powder, and this is one of the keys to doing this is you want the clear embossing powder. That is going to trap all of that color underneath. So no matter what you do to the top of this, you will always have those light colors that we blended on underneath everything. Then I'm going to make sure I have my heat tool nice and hot and bring it to my panel and melt all of that embossing powder. Once I gave this a second or two to cool, I'm just going to brush over that with a Swiffer cloth. That just takes off any excess powder that was left behind. And then I'm going to add ink on top of this. So I'm going to start with the colors you see listed at the top: mustard seed, carved pumpkin, and candied apple. The fired brick is something I brought in afterwards. As I was adding this mustard seed, I knew it wasn't going to be enough. I really wanted a drastic change between the colors. So afterwards, I'm going to come back and fix it. But I started with the mustard seed, the carved pumpkin, and then here I'm adding that candied apple. And after, I'm going to take a cloth and I'm just going to wipe off all of the excess ink. Because we heat embossed, all of that heat embossing is resisting this ink that we're laying on top. And you'll be able to see it does pop with some color. You'll be able to see that there is a difference between the shades, but it just wasn't enough. I really like bright colors. I like things to really stand out. So after I get this kind of brushed off with my cloth, I'm going to come back in and I'm actually kind of shifting the change of colors. So I'm going to start with the carved pumpkin and add that on top of that mustard seed that I had done. And that's really going to make this kind of pop off of the background. Then the candied apple, which is going right over that middle layer I had done with the carved pumpkin. And you can already see this is going to be a definite change to it. And then I needed a darker color for the bottom, so I brought in fired brick. And these are all the Distress Oxide inks. You could also do this with regular dye inks or distress inks as well. And then you're brushing off all of that excess ink, and you can see that definitely has a lot better effect to this. So after I wiped off all of that excess ink, I'm going to bring my heat tool back in and just reheat that embossing powder, and that just helps bring it a little bit more to the front and add that shine back to that background. Now to add a little bit of sparkle to this, I'm taking some of the Perfect Pearls, just adding a little bit onto my placemat there, adding a couple drops of water, and then taking my paintbrush and mixing that up really good, and I'm going to flick these onto my background. I really want the focus to be the background, but I needed just a little bit of shimmer to it. So just adding that little bit of flick to it really does help. For the sentiment, I am going to be using the Rainbow Greetings stamp set. And I had thought about using one of MFT's really large word dies, which I really love. But like I said before, I really wanted the focus to be the background and that technique. So I'm going with a simple greeting. I'm using some black cardstock, just prepping that with the anti-static powder tool again, inking that up with Versamark ink, and then I'm going to sprinkle on some white embossing powder. Now I noticed when I tapped off the excess that there were still a few little specks left behind. So I'd usually take a paintbrush and I just kind of lightly brush away any of that excess powder that was left behind. And then I can come in and melt that embossing powder with my heat tool. Now I want this to be just a really skinny strip, so I'm going to use my paper trimmer, lining the bottom of my letters up with the edge of my cutting guide there, and then I can go ahead and trim that. Now I did notice I didn't get it as skinny as I wanted, so I do take it back to my trimmer later on and trim that down even skinnier. So I trimmed my panel down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. That's one of my favorite sizes for my center panels because I love having an edge around it, and having that bright white really draws your eye into this background. Then I'm adding black foam squares to the back of my sentiment strip here. I like to use black foam squares with black cardstock because that kind of hides it. If you're looking at it from the side or if it's propped up somewhere on display, you won't see those foam squares. And then I'm going to line that up towards the top of my card, just using my tweezers to get that placed exactly where I want it, and then pushing that down to make sure it's secured to my background. And then in just a moment, I'll give you a close-up look of some of that shimmer that I had on there with the Perfect Pearls. I love this technique and how adding darker colors on top and really making that embossing underneath pop. So I hope you'll give this technique a try. It's really fun and very eye-catching. I want to thank you so much for stopping by today. Let me know in the comments if you've ever tried this technique before. All of the supplies will be listed down below in the video description. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.